Let's go ahead and begin our session. Welcome, everyone. I know we'll have others join in, but my name is Travis Bear, and I'm a clinical social worker, and I'm part of the advisory committee for this Faith Summit. And we want to thank all of you for joining with us. We know your time is very precious, and we appreciate your time to learn together with us. Especially right now, as we're considering everything that we've been experiencing with the windstorms. Our hearts and prayers are with everyone, and grateful that there's been no more serious problems out there. It's amazing how these conditions create communities that gather together, and I know in my own community, cleaning up and working together. And so, again, our hearts and prayers are out to everyone and who is continuing to clean up after things. And so, we'd like to begin with a prayer and blessing with this session. And we've invited Elder Evan Schmutz, who is General Authority for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he's also in the area president for the church. I'm hearing some feedback. I apologize for that. Again, Elder Schmutz is he's a General Authority for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and also in the Utah area presidency. And so, welcome, Elder Schmutz. I'm hoping that you've been able to connect. Are you?
Yes, I'm here, Brother Bear.
Perfect. Thank you. And mute myself. If you want to go ahead and
okay, thank you.
Prepared.
Our loving Father in heaven, with grateful hearts we gather in the spirit of worship and prayer. We also gather in fellowship and in the pure love of thy Son, Jesus Christ, which we feel in common for thy children, our brothers and sisters, in whatsoever circumstances and places they may be found. Heavenly Father, we thank thee for the gift of life, even when life grows difficult and we grow weary. When the path and journey of life is fraught with care and sorrow, we remain grateful for the gift of life. We are grateful for thy grace and for the gift of thy Holy Son. Today, as on other days, we are mindful of those among us who are particularly afflicted with sorrow, pain, loneliness, and despair, for whom hope is hard to hold on to when darkness gathers. We know that at times we may all suffer from the afflictions of life, and that some are suffering today. We know that sometimes life is a burden we feel is too heavy to carry. Wilt thou, Father, for these thy children, especially in such times, reach out thy hand to strengthen them? Wilt thou send people to provide companionship in times of loneliness and light in time of darkness? We pray for our brothers and sisters and ask thee, dear Father, to fulfill the promise of thy Son, that we will not be left comfortless, but will feel the love of God. We also pray, dear Father, that we might be reminded that none of us are left alone, for thou art there, and thou art mindful of thy children. Please give us compassion, strength, and inspired insight, that we might be instruments in thy hands to help one another through prayer and action. Bless us to befriend one another, to give light and hope and love to those in need. Bless us to be compassionate and understanding. Bless us to stand with each other and, where possible, to carry one another's burdens. We know that as we serve thy children, we serve thee. Today, we ask thy Spirit to be with us as we learn together, to guide and inspire those who teach and lead discussion. Bless us with hope in a brighter day through thy power and love. We thank thee for those who have served the weary and the downtrodden. We thank thee for professional healers and for those who heal through love and faith in God. Once again, we thank thee, O Father, for thy never-ending love and kindness. We pray for these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Elder Schmutz. We appreciate that. Invocation to our discussion today. And others who are on, please mute yourself until I turn the time over to our speaker. I wanted to just call some attention to a couple of things before we turn the time over to Dr. Supiano. Technology is a blessing and a challenge sometimes, and we're grateful for it. If you have any difficulties with connecting, please connect with Paul Putnam at the state, and his email is paulputnam@utah.gov. And hopefully he can help work through the connection problems. Also in our session today, we don't have the time that we would normally do for questions and answers throughout. So we would ask you to please direct any questions in the chat box, and we'll monitor those and respond as best we can. I hope I'm not frozen still. Benet sent a note in the chat box saying I'm frozen. If you have questions, please direct them to the chat box. And okay, great, thanks. So please don't raise the hands for questions. We'll do our best to possibly allow for a couple of minutes at the end to address any questions we've not been able to. And so, and we'll do our best with questions that you may have. Now, also, today is our third session of our Faith Summit, and the first two sessions have been really largely on prevention efforts. And this session takes a different approach, and we've titled this our healing action. Again, our consensus statement is faith in action, and this focus is going to be on healing. And so as we consider really the conditions we've been experiencing throughout this year with the COVID conditions, and even now with the wind problems, we're all experiencing different kinds of grief and loss. And so this session today is going to focus on healing with grief and loss related to suicide. And so I just want to turn the time over to my very good friend, Kathy Supiano. She is an expert, really, truly for grief and loss and healing. And she actually has a ministry of her own in ways for healing. And so greatly appreciate Kathy and sharing her time with us. And we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis. I love this gathering. I look forward to it every year. And so I tell my staff, this is my favorite gig. So I'm going to actually kind of clip along. I'm just leaving this slide up for a minute just to give you my contact information. And please know I'm happy to respond to people at any time afterwards. And if you can help me remember to announce our COVID initiative at the end of this, I'm happy to do so. So I wanted to just remind us about how suicide death it brings a different form of grief. Those who lose someone to suicide, and goodness knows we're all working on this to change this landscape, but people who lose someone to suicide death end up with intense feelings of anger, guilt, and shame. This leaves people who have lost someone to suicide perplexed and filled with doubt, and of course that can profoundly affect their faith. The surviving family and friends who had perhaps been caring for a person who was at high risk for suicide for many years might even feel relieved that, number one, their responsibility has ended, or as they are often told, that the person who died isn't suffering anymore. That can be painful to hear. But when people do entertain those feelings, they very often feel guilty about feeling relief. So these are profoundly affecting deaths. We also have to recognize, because I know we really do work so hard on prevention efforts here in Utah, but the rate of suicide is twice as high in families that have already lost someone to suicide. And we need to remember this as you're extending your ministry out into a family that's lost someone to suicide. Your efforts, everything you do, is also preventing the next suicide in that family or in that circle. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk through this experience with you, since most of you entertain the possibility of engaging in suicide loss with the family. And so you know you're entering into their world at a time of enormous crisis. So, what do we mean by crisis? A crisis is more than an upheaval. A crisis is actually an upheaval where we're pretty certain there's going to be a very bad outcome. So what I'd like to do is take a couple minutes and walk through a graphic, and this is a wonderful tool for helpers, I think, this particular graphic. So if you can join me at the start, look at the top here. This is where we all lived back in February before the pandemic. We lived in a state of relative equilibrium. We had this illusion that the world was a predictable place. And then the crisis happened. But now let's call this crisis a suicide death. And when that death happens, the family, the people who cared about the person who took their life, they are now in a state of disequilibrium. And if you look at this, this is now an upside down triangle, a tippy triangle. And when you enter in with a family that's lost someone to suicide, this is exactly what they tell you. They say, my world turned upside down. So I thought the world was a predictable place, and it is not. Now, this is human nature. Every time we are in a crisis, every single one of us does exactly the same thing. We do the coping skills we've always done. And you may say, for example, when I'm stressed, I call my mother and my mother reassures me. Or you might say, when I'm stressed, I pray and that brings me comfort. Or you might say, I slap on my running shoes and I go for a run and that really helps me. Or you may say, and you probably wouldn't say this out loud, I drink a fifth of Jack Daniels and that's how I cope. But when we're talking about this large a crisis, a death by suicide, it's important that we recognize that the tried and true coping skills are no match for this situation. And we, as helping people, need to help people at this junction, at the fork in the road. And what does that mean? If people proceed down this pathway, these are the choices and behaviors they choose. They may choose to avoid the problem and need to change. And we see that with the pandemic, where people are saying, I don't have any responsibility, I don't need to wear a mask. But in the case of suicide death, people can say, I'm just going to go on the way I was. People, and this is very common in Utah, attempt to handle it alone. And they say, I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps, or I'm tough, or I'm strong. And we give people the message in all of our faith communities, and we all do this. We just have to tough it out. We have to be strong. And even though we talk about vulnerability, as faith communities, we're actually not very comfortable with people reaching out for help. Or this is a third option. People work harder and harder and harder again at these solutions that we've already said don't work. Now, that doesn't mean they're not necessarily good coping skills, but if your coping skill is running, you cannot run 24 hours a day. And if your coping skill is calling your mother, you cannot do that constantly. And if your coping skill is drinking that fifth of Jack Daniels, well, I think we all know where that leads. So if people choose this pathway, what happens is they unfortunately remain in this state of continued disequilibrium. And I just want you to think about your faith communities now, and you have many, many people that are part of your ministry that are living in a state of disequilibrium. So here is our task as helpers. We want people to move down this direction. We want to help people acknowledge a problem that things have got to change. This person has died and the world will never be the same. We want people to feel comfortable turning to others for assistance, and we're going to talk about that and how best to make that happen in a little bit. And then this is the hard work. When we're faced with a crisis, we have to discover new ways of thinking and living. This is a painful process. This is much harder than this way, but this painful process will lead us to this new equilibrium. It will be a new flat bottom triangle. But truthfully, in the face of suicide death, this flat bottom triangle will never be that flat bottom triangle ever again. So, what happens in the United States when people die and when people come together in grief? This is sort of what we think happens. This is sort of your very ordinary white, black clad funeral gathered around a casket ready for burial. But that is only one form of grief in the United States. In the United States, we are now a multi-ethnic and diverse nation. They have a we have a variety of death practices and memorial practices. Here we have a very traditional African American funeral. Here, this is a picture from Canada from a colleague of mine in British Columbia. And this is one of the First Nations funeral, and a beautiful action where people take off their wraps or their serapes and place them on the grave. And our grief practices were rapidly changing even before the pandemic hit. We've gone from using the language of funerals to memorials to life celebrations. You can be sure that when I began my work in a clinical practice 40 years ago, we never saw balloons in the sanctuary, much less My Little Pony balloons. This is obviously a child's funeral. Dove releases, butterfly releases, these are all becoming part of the practice now. But let's look at how COVID has changed some of these practices and how the violent nature of death in the United States has framed our public grief. So you're seeing on the left 9/11, of course, and on the right you're seeing the Challenger disaster. But public spontaneous expressions of grief happen at the individual level too. And here we're seeing a roadside death. This is actually a very interesting picture because this death was a suicide death. This is a person who drove a car into an abutment as the form of suicide. But we also have ways we collectively respond to grief in the United States. And those of you who are my age will easily remember these pictures. This is JFK's funeral. This is Arlington National Cemetery. And this is the motorcade with his caisson, his casket in the caisson being drawn by the horses. And you can see Washington, D.C.'s main thoroughfares lined for his memorial. So there are precedents for public grief, but this is actually how public grief responds to trauma and all forms of trauma. Motor vehicle accident, the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, and the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Miami. So where does that leave us now with grief? And this has huge implications for suicide grief. Even as the death rate for COVID is increasing, the death rate for both suicide death and overdose death have increased dramatically in the state of Utah during this half year. But this is how people are having to grieve now. The funeral home with people able to come in one at a time, the lone bugler at Arlington National Cemetery. And think of the number of people who have lost a family member or friend to suicide, to overdose death, to a motor vehicle accident, to COVID in these last 6 months that have not been able to grieve as they would have wanted to. So grief at this time is going unwitnessed. So I want to talk about that particularly in terms of suicide death. But we have this tension, and this is a parallel experience of grief being very public, but still being very private. Oh, excuse me. All right. So as we see the pandemic as the backdrop here, here we see the fourth wave, and this is really where we're going to see an increase in suicide death, and as well as burnout in our mental health professionals. Another important way we can enter. This is a horrifying statistic to me, and this is less than a month old from the CDC that since the pandemic began, 11% of adults have contemplated suicide, more than double in prior years. Scarier still, 26% of young people, 50%, 15% of African Americans, 19% of Hispanics. Think how large our Hispanic community is here in Utah. 22% of essential workers, 31% of unpaid caregivers. And unpaid caregivers, by almost by definition, are people caring for an elderly parent. In the case of Utah, the highest proportion of caring for older adults is for older adults with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. All right, so returning to suicide loss now, with that as the backdrop, and if you attended my talk last year, you'll see how markedly different the world is now. But in suicide loss, our goal in grief care is ultimately to distinguish the griever experience with the circumstances of the death from their relationship with the person who died. This takes quite a bit of time, but over time, we want people to be able to hold in their hearts the person who died, and while acknowledging the reality of suicide, keep that reality at, I like to say, at arm's length. So that's not the first thing one thinks about when one thinks about the person they love who died. All right, so returning to our goals for today, and what I'm inviting you to do is to reflect on a situation where you're asked to bring comfort to a family. What I'm going to ask you to do is just reflect for a moment on your own congregation, on your own parish, on your own synagogue, on your own ward community, and think about being tasked with visiting a family where a family member has died by suicide. So I'm going to share this from a little place of humor. This is actually one of my favorite cartoons. Here we have the parrot on sale at the pet store, deep discount. And why? It's because this parrot's not a good talker. This parrot can't talk at all, and so it's being advertised as a good listener. And in the case of a suicide death, this is the most important thing when you're bringing family comfort, is to show up and listen, not to offer answers, because truthfully, you have no answers. You have no answers. You, as a member of the faith community, are not there to explain why this person took their life. Also, and this is my only word here in caps, avoid. Avoid advice giving. We'll talk about ways to bring meaningful suggestions in a moment, but avoid advice giving. Avoid platitudes, and avoid, and I know I'm talking to religious leaders here, but I'm going to say this, avoid inappropriate or premature spiritual support. As a grief therapist, I can tell you unequivocally that when people come into our grief support groups, one of the things that is most painful for them, and they share this in the group, are the things that people said to them with the intention of bringing them comfort, but were actually hurtful. Things like, God needed that baby more than you did, or aren't you glad your father is now finally in his heavenly home? These things may be entirely true, but they're not helpful when the family says, well, frankly, I would rather have her back right now. And a lot of times we say that for our own comfort. After that, then, and this is really where you are starting to offer suggestions, what people need after a tragic event is they need immediate care. And you notice I've got my picture with the mask on up there. We're going to take that message over and over again. So when you show up at the house, you're wearing a mask. But we encourage people to try to get sleep as much as possible and to stick to a routine as much as possible, including trying to interact with people that they find supportive. So we want to advocate a certain amount of distraction. People do need to take a break. We need to, and really faith leaders can do this, encourage people to rest and take a break from the heavy lifting of grief and encourage them to do that as a break, not as avoidance. You can be helpful reviewing social supports with them. People do need support from loving people when they've had a death by suicide, but they should also be free to say no to people who are not helpful. At this time, your responsibility is to support the care of the family and then to establish a plan to follow up with that family. And notice the bold text here, do follow up. It's vital that after that first visit, that there's another visit and there's another visit and there's another visit because this family will need you for a long time. I'd like to talk a little bit about faith traditions in terms of honoring the body. And again, I've got the picture with the mask there because much of this has changed in the time of COVID. But when it comes to caring for the body, it's important if you are the person representing the faith community, or if you are the person who will be conducting the memorial or the funeral service, to immediately gain an understanding of what the family prefers and what is possible. So, for example, if the family wants an open casket, and the death was particularly violent and grossly modified the body, that's something where you have to confer with the funeral home. I am very impressed with the funeral homes in Utah, particularly in this time of COVID, how careful most of them have been. We've heard some stories, but most of them have been extremely responsible. But you can imagine that sometimes the circumstances of a death by suicide make things difficult for an open casket or a viewing. That said, most people who lose a family member value being able to see the body. And that is something that could actually happen before the funeral and before preparing the body. We've had circumstances where the body was, particularly the head, was markedly altered. And so the family was content to hold the hand when the head was draped. And so, again, a funeral home, a responsible funeral home, has explored these alternatives with many families. Now, to the extent that it's possible, allow the family to take care of the body within the faith tradition. In many faith traditions, the family actually assists with grooming and preparing the body. Now, those rules are all changed in the time of COVID, and that's off limits. And so you may actually have to advocate with the funeral home for best public health practices here. So this is quite different than this conversation we had a year ago. It's also important that spiritual care is essential throughout the process, not only at the immediate memorial service, but as the gravestone is later installed. That can be months later, as you know, to get a headstone, or as ashes are distributed depending on the faith tradition. So this is the reality of ministry. This is not a one and done. You can see there are many steps to attend to here. Now, it's also important to honor the person who died. Now, again, when we're talking about a death by suicide, we really do want to focus on a correct, a truthful, but a compassionate remembrance of the person who died, uncoupled from the circumstances of the death. Unless the family specifically requests that you discuss this as a suicide death, and some families are now, they want this to have a prevention method or message. it's really important to honor the life of the person, not the circumstances of the death. And there's another reason we want to do that. We also, this is so important, we want to take care not to glorify the circumstances of the death. And I'm afraid on social media, we see a lot of glorification of suicide. So, for example, you don't want to say something like, he's finally out of his pain, or he was too good or too sensitive for this world. We see this on social media every day. This actually accelerates patterns of suicidality in people who hear these messages that, oh, this is the way out of pain, or I'm too good for this world, or too sensitive for this world. And I'm not saying that that's not true. Yes, there are people who have terminal depression that in a way, the life ending by suicide, as horrible as this is, does in the mind of the person dying relieve their pain. But we want to be so careful about our messaging here. So instead, I encourage you to emphasize what is lost. And, especially when we see lives of younger people, to mourn actually all that he or she might have been in the life that will not be lived. All right. But of concern, and I think if we think about the diversity, even within our communities of faith and between our communities of faith, I think you will agree with me that as a society, we lack the language for grief and norms for grief and a way to collectively grieve, to grieve as whole communities, particularly the grief of suicide. So, this is now the start of my challenge to you. Grief that initiates social movements can be transformative, and you're going to recognize many of these images. The Trevor Project and AFSP that have worked to address suicide grief, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, Moms Demand Action in Every Town. Every one of these organizations was initiated by grieving individuals who said, I want no one else to suffer the way my family has suffered. So, what can we do with this? So, what I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about today is the compassionate community movement and increasing grief literacy. So, what is grief literacy? It's not just being able to read the word death or grief. So, you're not going to get off that easy. But this is a movement to develop and expand our understanding of grief in ways that benefit all people experiencing loss. And I'm highlighting this article because I'm happy to share these articles with you later. So what this means is a public, in communities, nations, cities, neighborhoods, parishes, ward communities, that is able to respond with appropriate support and relevant and correct information to care for grief at the front door and prevent complications later down the line. So, why do we need this in the United States? We live in and I don't need to tell you, extremely fragmented societies. We also recognize that grief is not just a problem in the mind of the griever alone, but affects their entire life, including their social life and their spiritual life. We know that far too often, grief is followed by loneliness. Again, something that can only be attended to in community. And frankly, I could use a little help here because bereavement care is almost always located within clinical and institutional forms of care. I will say that, and I'm sure you are aware that the United States is a uniquely death denying culture. We're also a grief denying culture. And so many of the things that people say and do are socially awkward and may actually compound suffering. We have all seen experiences where the friends, the colleagues, the health professionals just evaporate when the death finally happens. They may be insufficiently compassionate. They may offer insensitive comments or platitudes. So, in the United States right now, most grief care is located within hospice and palliative care agencies, and it's only offered by those who are served by the agency. Bereavement care is offered within these settings by mental health professionals such as myself, and there's very little access to this type of care outside of the healthcare system. And that's actually one of the reasons I'm exceedingly proud about Caring Connections, because we serve all forms of grief. And then usually grief care begins at the death rather than at the beginning of either the disease trajectory or when the loss is actually starting. And we also don't provide grief care for non death losses. We're not very good at supporting people during divorce or family estrangement or infertility, but we can be better. And this is how we can be better. We can do this probably within our faith communities more than any other place. But this is my challenge, that we create these compassionate communities. This challenges the conviction that death and dying is only the work of clinicians or institutions. So, again, we're not just saying the church here, we're saying beyond the church. This is everyone's responsibility, and that's why we're using community in the broadest sense of the word. So, if we can do this, we will shift the conversation about and the location of death into community spaces. And we're talking here truthfully about that word compassion. And I think most of you know that the derivation of the word compassion actually is co suffering. So it's not that I'm suffering for your loss, it's that I will be a yoke fellow with you and I will help shoulder some of your suffering. How do we do that? Compassionate communities have the capacity to access, process, and use knowledge regarding the experience of loss. They have the knowledge to facilitate an understanding and reflection, skills that enable action, and values, shared values that inspire compassion and care. So this takes us out of our silos of individual cultures and brings us into interdependence of individuals within and across cultures. And so, Travis, that's why I'm so excited to be here today, because we have representatives from so many faith communities and we can collaborate both within our communities but also across our communities. So, grief literacy is actually not an intervention, it's a paradigm shift, and it addresses the social context that influence how we grieve. So, I just want you to think about this. What if a family that lost someone to suicide no longer needs to feel stigmatized or isolated by that type of death? All right, let's talk about where this lands us in terms of the pandemic now, because now our suicide postvention care is happening in this backdrop. All right, this is where we were all in January. And then we became increasingly aware of the pandemic, and then it hit. And it started first, of course, in Washington State, then New York, New Jersey, and it has expanded around the country. But our initial response to this pandemic, and this is true of communities of faith, just like it's true of my community, the community of healthcare workers, is everybody stepped up. And this is what we did. We cheered for our healthcare workers. We were grateful for our school teachers when we were trying to homeschool our own children. And people gathered together. But the pandemic raged on and people started splintering. And this is where we are right now. All right. We're in this state of disillusionment. Will we get a vaccine? How will we distribute a vaccine? Am I safe to go out? And I want you to think about families now that have lost someone to suicide and are further isolated. I want you to think about people who are at risk for suicide and are now incredibly isolated. But the rest of us cannot yield to this disillusionment. We must stay in the game here. We must continue to be compassionate and care. So this is where we have to go. This is what starts after we have a vaccine available. This is our long road. And so this is the road post-COVID, but our road with suicide recovery is going to start way down here. So this is my bad news. We have a lot of work to do to address the mental health needs that we have in the country. So I'm just going to show this little slide just to let you know. We consider people in COVID recovery and COVID grief to have a heightened risk of suicide. So in addition to our suicide survivor support groups that we offer, and thank you to the state of Utah for sharing CARES funds with us. Starting in next week, we're offering a COVID grief support group and a COVID recovery group. So this is for people who've had COVID and are still struggling to recover. And there are thousands of people in this situation in Utah. So I will share that information with Travis, and he will share it with you later. But again, as we're returning now to suicide loss, I just want to emphasize the risk, the highest level of risk among people is among people who think they should have been able to prevent it and people who witnessed it. Those, and you'll have this slide, those are the highest risk people grieving suicide death. This overwhelming sense of loss that there's nothing left. People who might have had pre-existing depression or anxiety, and people who perceive themselves to be isolated. And so for you in the faith community, I'm underlining this word perceived. You will have people sitting in your congregations who appear to be surrounded by people, but they feel that they're alone. The other thing we have to consider is people who've had multiple losses. Rare is the person coming to a suicide death that has not had other losses. And so again, as you're exploring this with people and you're saying, and this is just the way I do it, up until today, when your son died by suicide, what was the biggest loss you ever had? And I tell the family, I'd like to hear that story, and I listen very carefully to that story. And if that story indicates that that loss prepared people for this loss, I'm going to be less worried than if I feel that these losses have been stacking up and unattended to. And so this is the family that feels that they're not going to do well here. Those are the people who deserve so much more attention. All right, so we've talked about honoring the body and we've talked about honoring the person who died. Let's remember how we honor the family in this circumstance. So we've talked about your first visit. They're in a state of shock. I need to tell you that they will not remember anything you've said. So if you can leave some written materials, that will help. Usually by the time we have a memorial service, that's the real start of grief. That's when it really sinks in with people. We offer that immediate response, but offer the best of your faith's traditions and comforts, all right? Every single one of you knows how to do a funeral well, and this is where you have to do your very best. Then, this is a really important thing, you write in your calendar the day of that death and the person who died's birthday, etc. And then a year later, send a note, call, go visit on the anniversary of the death. Remember the birthday, especially if this was a child who died. Move remembrance from the day of the death to the day of the birthday. And the greatest and lasting fear of families who've lost someone to suicide is that the person who died will be forgotten. So again, shifting the story to the life of the person and sharing some of those stories, that's going to be very, very important to help this family grieve.
Sometimes we find ourselves surrounded by dark clouds with nothing to be grateful for. Dark clouds will always fill our lives at times. But when we see others celebrating the storm, our whole view changes. And gratitude for the blessings of our life allows us to weather the storm. If every day is a gift, then the only response is gratitude. And yes, there are obstacles in life where we feel unbalanced and hesitate. Perhaps our fears might come true. When we look back, those very challenges become blessings to strengthen our spirit. Planting a seed is a miracle. Tending it, an act of faith, an act of joy. Always, our adventure has spills and losses, and yet, each is the perfect time to start over. Still, there are times in life's great journey when again we are lost or sad. We lose our spirit. And almost without knowing, negativity enters all we do. It's a weight to carry until we finally learn to let go. Then, what joy when we see the shining heart of another who joins us on our way. When our hearts are joyful, the gloomy spirit has no place to land. With joy in our hearts, we take our place in the mysterious unfolding of the world. And all along, the birds keep singing, and a grateful heart sings with them.
I guess there's that little gremlin out in the internet these days that's messing around a little bit. So I hope, and this did work out time-wise, if there are questions that people want to ask from their own perspective, I see Paul's note that he will send the Vimeo link out to people. That is a video that's from the Gratitude Revealed series. It's well worth viewing, I think, if you missed it. Okay, so perhaps if we could have any questions related to the content or concerns that people may have, particularly in terms of grief, as we have that now this intersection between suicide loss and then the backdrop of the pandemic. Any thoughts or concerns that people want to voice or questions? Thank you, Paul. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. And maybe that's all right. But some of you are probably downloading that video right now.
Thank you for sharing that video, Kathy. I hadn't seen that one. Maybe a comment, Kathy, on the connection. One of the things that's impressing me too here is the connection between the healing and the supporting suicide loss survivors, the connection between the healing and prevention efforts.
Yeah, actually, Travis, that's a very good question. So when I shared this slide about the family that's lost someone to suicide is now at increased risk for suicide, we do see that highest risk in families that feel isolated or shunned. And so, for all of our conversation about prevention efforts, I just can't overemphasize the value of just showing up and being silent. And I think this is something that Henri Nouwen talks about in some of his theology, that the friend that's the most valuable at the time is the friend who doesn't offer ideas or solutions, but just is the friend who cares. It seems like some people are actually still hearing the movie. All right, I'm not sure why that is.
Yeah.
But in any case, I do think that's a vital part of suicide prevention, Travis, is this idea of communities and communities being engaged. We know from suicide risk, and I think we talked about that in the session last week, the danger of not feeling like you belong. And when people are part of caring, integrated, loving communities, non-judgmental communities, communities that are characterized by forgiveness and, just cutting each other some slack, those are communities where people feel welcome, no matter how distressed they are. Now, I do have to say that the most loving community itself is not protective, but it is certainly one of the protective factors. So you're right, Andrea, just showing up, being there and listening. Okay. So I just would add to that. I think a lot of times we think we have to have the answer or offer a solution. So I always sort of tell a little joke about myself here. And I know the movie Gone with the Wind has come under pressure lately, but there is that one scene in the movie Gone with the Wind where the little girl who jumps her pony over the wall and she falls and breaks her neck and she dies. And then her parents, Rhett and Scarlett, are of course distraught like any parent. And because the little girl was afraid of the dark, her father, Rhett Butler, big, strong Rhett Butler, barricades himself in the bedroom with the child's dead body and will not allow her to be buried because she's afraid of the dark. And so no one knows what to do. And so the kind friend Melanie goes into the room. And when we see that movie, we see the camera show Melanie going into the room. And then the next scene is the funeral. And I remember seeing that when I was in junior high, and everybody else is going, "Oh, isn't that sweet?" And I said, "What in the world did she say?" But the truth is, we have no idea what she said. There are no magic words. All of us love our scripture, and we care very deeply about the Word of God as we understand it. But there's a time to just be there with no words and be present, and to bring the family comfort just by saying, "This is too momentous and horrific event in your life for me not to acknowledge it. And I will be here and I will sit with you." Oh, Kim says, "Is there a place we can take our friends that are contemplating suicide to get help?" Certainly, don't leave them at that moment. Then I would go on and encourage you to use the resources we have. In immediate concern, of course, the suicide hotline, the crisis line. Don't try to handle this alone. But again, and I say this all the time, I'm so very worried about you that I will not leave you until we agree on help. And I would like to start, if I were the friend, let's connect with some professional help. Thanks, Travis, for typing that in. And the crisis line is 801-587-3000. Either of those are your immediate and best ways. So always start there. And they will be as helpful to you as to your friend. You can call the hotline and just ask for guidance and say, "Hey, I have a friend in this dark place and I don't know what to do or say." And you will be speaking with a very accomplished crisis worker who will help you navigate that. And thank you, Andrea. Oh, yes, but there's the new digit, the 3-digit number isn't active yet. But we're all hoping that will come soon. Okay, Travis, I think I went right up to my time.
Well, Kathy, I always love to hear you share your expertise, and all of us really are honestly blessed to have you. You really are a gift to our community, and again, we can't thank you enough for your expertise and your own, again, from your own personal ministry, right, and helping so many.
And Travis, to that point, I will tell you that the state has been very generous with us about providing grief support training for people who want to learn a model of grief support. It's either an all-day training or a half-day training. And I would love to do that type of training for clergy and faith leaders in a specific conference day to be scheduled. So again, I'm going to ask you to distribute a lot of information to your attendees today, but I'd be delighted to have you do that.
That's a wonderful offer, Kathy. Thank you so much.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Kathy, again, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for your patience with our connections. We recognize that likely the wind has caused some problems, and we appreciate your patience. We are going to share the recording and this information, and so watch for that to come your way with resources that Kathy has shared. And also, we'll send a survey with that information, and appreciate your feedback. And again, thank you for joining us. Next week will be our concluding session, and that will feature some other excellent speakers. But thank you again, and prayers to all of you, and appreciate your time.